Okay, I'm responding to Sebastian's claim that the violence we experience in modern day society is unaffected by the presence of violent video games. The secondary claims are that video games are harmless, that violent video games do not cause violent behavior, they help to vent anger effectively, and he provides a personal experience to prove this claim. The evidence used to support his first claim that violent video games are harmless is flawed because the evidence presented from a psychologist at King's College contradicts the claim and creates an irrelevant thesis by proving a separate argument. The quote states that after lab tests, video games have been shown to cause a short-term increase in aggression, which is contradicting because regardless of how short the term of aggression is, he still admits that video games create aggression, which is related to violent behavior. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice, only 7.3% of violent crimes are premeditated, meaning that the other 92.7% of violent crimes are done on impulse. If something is done on impulse, you don't need a history of built-up aggression. The short-term increase in aggression that the psychologist refers to is all it takes for someone to do something violent, as proven by the 92.7% of violent crime offenders who were charged with acting out of sudden impulse. The quote also says that violent news and television has the same effect as violent video games, and that delinquent peers, depression, and having an abusive family causes more violence than exposure to media violence. Even though those other factors may play an important role, he's still admitting that video games are still harmful. This creates an irrelevant thesis because these facts do not prove the actual claim that video games are harmless. It instead supports a separate argument making the comparison between these different influential elements of violence false analogies. I'm challenging the evidence behind Sebastian's second claim that violent video games do not cause violent behavior, but instead are a telltale sign of other mental issues and could help stop massacres. Sebastian presents a quote by James Allen Fox, a professor of criminology at Northeastern University, that states that preoccupation with video games is more a symptom of personal problem than a cause of them. However, this article goes on to say that relatively cheap, accessible, and time-consuming electronic diversions keep people occupied who might otherwise be out getting into trouble. This shows that the author is not arguing that video games help diagnose people with other mental diseases. Instead, he's simply saying that video games are time-consuming and that people don't have the time to invest in acts of violence. And therefore, there's nothing to prove that people playing video games can stop any massacres. There's no statistical evidence or examples that support any instances of this happening before, of these preventing any violent acts before. And this makes the possibility that any massacre being prevented could be prevented by people playing video games, a hypothetical situation. The third claim that violent video games can vent anger lacks credible reasoning. Therefore, I will present another counterclaim to disprove this argument. It is stated that a healthy individual can use this tool in relieving everyday stress and anger, but the only one to support this claim is a statement done by a cognitive scientist at the University of Texas that states, people who play the game with the goal to vent their anger seem to have succeeded. There's no reasoning to connect the video games to being a stress reliever. In fact, the testimony given isn't even certain that this technique actually worked. It just says that it seems to have worked, which means it may or may not have been successful. Instead, according to U.S. News and World Reports, once addicted to video games, children were more likely to become depressed, anxious, or have other social phobias. Not surprisingly, children from a study of 3,034 who were hooked on video games also saw their school performance suffer. This shows the exact opposite, that video games actually cause more stress, depression, and anxiety, and unsatisfactory school performance. The personal experience he gives to support his main claim is contradicted and contains a false cause. First, Sebastian states that he himself plays only a few hours of video games a day, and that this is not nearly enough to cause any violent tendencies. This testimony is telling us that he is not a credible source because he's not representative of the average gamer who might play more than just a few hours a day and does exhibit violent behaviors. The false cause is created when a quote by the FBI is presented that says violent crime is at an all-time low in America. Meanwhile, game sales are on the rise in the U.S. This is a violation of cause and effect reasoning because there's no reasoning to prove that game sales are directly related to the decrease in crime rates. This gives one reason to believe that these events are mutually exclusive and that this relationship could be a mere coincidence. No direct correlation is presented to prove the claim that modern-day society is affected by violent video games. In conclusion, because of the lack of statistics, the generalized evidence, and the contradictory ideas presented in the speech, there's no reason to believe that violent video games are harmless, that they don't cause violent behavior, or they help to prevent anger. Therefore, the violence we experience in modern day society is indeed affected by the presence of violent video games.
All right, the main points are labeled pretty clearly. As you get to the individual points, you signpost them well. On the first point, the whole argument about aggression is explained, but it does sound to me like you're engaging in an equivocation that aggression automatically means violence, and I'm not exactly sure that that's a legitimate interpretation of what's going on here. The consequence of your definition and the way that you are pursuing it seems to suggest that ultimately the violence would have to occur immediately as a result of playing the game, and you don't offer any examples of that, so I'm not sure why that particular point is proven by your analysis here. In fact, it seems like the advocate's argument on this point is a little bit more rational in that context. On the second point, I thought that you did a little bit better job here challenging the way the testimony was being used by the advocate and suggesting that they were making an inference that's not valid given the amount of information that's supported there. I thought that was a pretty reasonable press on that particular issue. The third point, you kind of suggest that it's, there's a lack of support for this, that it's not relevant, and I'm not sure why that is. You are really rushing through some of the explanations, so it's not always as clear as it could be. The idea that it doesn't reduce stress, okay, I can see again that there might be a legitimate press on that argument. I thought that your clearest argument was information that showed that kids who play games at high levels become addicted and they develop other social problems as a consequence of this. And to me, that was the most direct response you had to the argument, and it also involved independent research on your part to address that issue. So I thought that that was the clearest part of your argument. The notion at the end that there's a contradiction and a false cause that's being presented, I just think that you've misunderstood the argument that the advocate's making. The advocate's not making the argument that violence has gone down because the games are more available and they're more violent. They're simply attempting to show that this statistical relationship undermines the claim that violent video games cause violence in society because of the opposite impact. They're not making a causality argument here. They're challenging a causality argument with this, and your response to it seems to misunderstand that particular conclusion. At the end of the speech, I do think that you make the assumption that if the opposite has been proven, that you're correct here, and I don't think that that's a good inference to make. I think you want to go back to the argument that says, look, the advocate's arguments are insufficient to prove the claims that they demonstrated, and if there's any grounds to suggest that there is evidence that leads to the opposite conclusion, that you'd need a stronger argument to overcome that. I think that's the way you need to present that argument. All right, thank you.